The lights blazed hot on the debate stage, casting sharp shadows against the deep red backdrop. The air was thick with anticipation, cameras sweeping across an audience torn between nervous laughter and hushed silence. Everyone knew this was no ordinary debate. Healthcare and taxes weren't abstract tonight, they were weapons. And in the center of it all stood two men who could not have been more different. Ted Cruz leaned into his microphone with the polished grin of a man who had rehearsed every syllable. His voice carried that familiar sharpness, laced with mockery. My opponent believes in the fairy tale of socialism. Free healthcare, free college, free everything. But let's be clear, there's nothing free about government control. What he offers isn't compassion. It's dependency. The crowd shifted, some clapping, others groaning. Cruz smirked, relishing the tension. He had thrown the first punch, and he believed it had landed. But then, silence. Bernie Sanders leaned forward in his chair, hands folded, his gaze steady. He didn't rush to respond. He let the pause grow heavier, more uncomfortable with every second. The cameras zoomed in. The audience leaned closer. The stillness itself became a weapon. Finally, Bernie's gravelly voice cut through. Senator Cruz calls it a fairy tale, he said, eyes burning with restrained fire. Well, I'll tell you what's a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale to think a nation can remain strong when millions of its people go bankrupt because they got cancer. It's a fairy tale to think tax breaks for billionaires will feed the hungry child in Texas or Vermont. And it's a fairy tale, Senator, to believe that cruelty dressed up as policy makes you tough. It doesn't. It makes you small. The room erupted. Gasps, cheers, applause. It was chaos contained only by the walls of that debate hall. Even the moderators struggled to hide their reactions as Cruz's confident smirk twitched for the briefest moment. And in that instant, everyone watching knew, this wasn't going to be the dry exchange of policy points they had expected. This was going to be something else. Something raw, visceral, and unforgettable. But this was only the beginning. What came next would leave even Cruz stunned. Across the nation, living rooms flickered with the glow of television screens. Families leaned forward on worn couches, their eyes fixed on the stage. For some, this debate was entertainment. But for countless others, it was life or death. They weren't just watching Sanders and Cruz spar over ideology. They were watching two competing visions of America collide head-on. In a small apartment in Ohio, a mother folded hospital bills on her lap like a gambler shuffling cards she could never win with. Her son, only 6 years old, had survived leukemia, but the chemotherapy left her drowning in debt. For her, the question wasn't whether Sanders sounded passionate or Cruz sounded polished. The question was simple: would her child have a future, or would the system bury them in bankruptcy? On the other side of the country, in Texas, a laid-off oil worker stared at the screen with crossed arms. His health insurance had vanished with his job, and every cough now carried a shadow of fear. He didn't care about Senate procedure. He cared about whether one unexpected trip to the emergency room would erase the last of his savings. These Americans weren't political pawns. They were the heartbeat of the stakes pulsing through that debate hall. And they knew what Cruz represented, the belief that the free market, unburdened and untouched, would somehow deliver fairness. But they also knew, deep down, that the free market had never once stepped in to pay a medical bill when the insurance company refused. The debate wasn't just about numbers or tax rates. It was about dignity. Who gets to live without fear of medical bankruptcy? Who carries the burden of America's prosperity, and who reaps its rewards? Cruz, with his Ivy League polish and cutting wit, spoke for those who already had shields against hardship. Bernie, with his blunt cadence and unwavering moral outrage, spoke for those who had been left defenseless. The atmosphere in the hall reflected that divide. Half the crowd cheered Cruz's warnings about government control, their applause sharp and insistent. The other half roared back for Bernie, voices trembling with urgency, as though this single night might tip the balance of their futures. The moderators shuffled nervously, aware they weren't refereeing a debate but witnessing a proxy war between two Americas. Healthcare and taxes, two words that sounded sterile on paper, had become symbols. They represented the kitchen tables where families broke down over bills. They represented the boardrooms where executives toasted record profits. They represented whether America was, at its core, a country for the few or for the many. Sanders knew it. Cruz knew it. And the millions watching at home felt it in their bones. The stakes were no longer abstract, they were personal, urgent, immediate. Cruz, emboldened by his opening jab, leaned forward, his tone sharpening like a blade. Senator Sanders doesn't tell you the truth. His so-called free healthcare is a government takeover that will destroy your choices, your freedoms, your future. This is not compassion, it's control. The room rumbled, divided once again, but beneath the noise there was a subtle shift. Because as Cruz sharpened his attack, Bernie was preparing something that would flip the script. Ted Cruz did not stumble into power. He built his career with meticulous precision, polished in the crucible of elite institutions that rewarded sharp tongues and sharper elbows. Born in Canada to a Cuban father and American mother, Cruz quickly embraced the image of a man destined for the spotlight. At Princeton, he became notorious on the debate circuit, not just for winning, but for the smug confidence with which he skewered opponents. Those who sparred with him rarely forgot it. Cruz didn't argue to understand. He argued to dominate. Harvard Law followed, where professors noted his intellect but whispered about his arrogance. One classmate recalled that Cruz seemed less interested in learning than in proving he was the smartest man in the room. And to many, that arrogance was not just an annoyance. It was a preview of the man he would become. From the moment Cruz entered politics, his strategy was clear: align himself with power, flatter the wealthy, and wield his rhetorical skills like a sword. He spoke of small government and individual freedom, yet behind the curtain, his campaign coffers swelled with money from corporations that thrived on government loopholes and subsidies. Oil giants, Wall Street financiers, pharmaceutical companies, Cruz was their champion, railing against regulation while defending the tax breaks and bailouts that kept their profits soaring. It was this duality that defined him: the preacher of austerity who defended corporate welfare, the self-proclaimed patriot who shut down the government to score points for his career. To his base, he was a fighter. To his critics, he was a showman willing to burn the house down if it meant standing in the ashes and declaring victory. On the Senate floor, Cruz sharpened his reputation. He reveled in marathon speeches, one famously laced with a reading from Dr. Seuss' Green Eggs and Ham. It wasn't policy. It was theater, political performance art designed to showcase his defiance rather than solve problems. He cast himself as the lone warrior, the man bold enough to say what others feared. Yet the contradictions piled higher with each passing year. When Cruz railed against healthcare reform, he thundered about government overreach. Yet his campaign bankrolled by insurance companies told another story. When he denounced socialism, he did so while protecting subsidies for oil executives. He promised freedom for the average American, yet fought tooth and nail to defend the privileges of the wealthy elite. Cruz's debating style mirrored these contradictions. He thrived on sharp barbs, smug pauses, and the art of painting his opponent as reckless. Audiences often mistook his confidence for conviction. But beneath the polish lay fragility. Cruz hated being challenged by facts that cut deeper than rhetoric. He could deliver rehearsed lines with theatrical flair, but when confronted with raw authenticity, when an opponent spoke not from notes, but from lived experience, Cruz often faltered. And that was the danger he faced on the stage with Bernie Sanders. Cruz was rehearsed, armed with statistics stripped of context, and phrases polished for applause lines. He had mastered the takedown, the smirk, the condescending shrug that implied he alone held the wisdom of the room. Yet arrogance, like glass, shatters under enough pressure. Because what Cruz had never truly faced was someone who could not be rattled. Someone who refused to play the game of performance politics. Someone who had spent decades not in boardrooms or Ivy League clubs, but in the trenches with working people. Cruz believed he could steamroll Sanders with practiced mockery and corporate talking points. But he underestimated something far more dangerous than polish: authenticity. He had perfected the art of the takedown. But while Cruz perfected the art of the takedown, he was about to face a man who had mastered the art of truth. Long before Bernie Sanders became a household name, long before he stood beneath the unforgiving lights of a national debate stage, he was just a boy from Brooklyn. Born in 1941 to working-class immigrant parents, Bernie grew up in a rent-controlled apartment where money was always tight and hope had to stretch further than the paycheck. His father, a paint salesman from Poland, had lost most of his family in the Holocaust. His mother, a woman who dreamed of owning a home but never lived to see that dream fulfilled, carried the weight of survival on her shoulders. From those early years, Bernie understood something that Cruz never could: what it meant to struggle, not as a political talking point, but as a daily reality. As a teenager, Bernie wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was always listening, always questioning. He saw injustice not as theory, but as the fabric of his neighborhood: families scraping by, workers exhausted, immigrants pushed to the margins. These weren't abstractions, they were neighbors, friends, his own family. And when he walked the streets of Brooklyn, hearing accents from all over the world, he came to believe in something bigger than himself: that dignity should not depend on your bank account, and fairness should not be negotiable. At the University of Chicago, Bernie's convictions sharpened into action. While Cruz perfected his debating skills at Princeton, Bernie was marching in the streets for civil rights. He joined sit-ins against segregated housing, got arrested protesting injustice, and fought for those whose voices were silenced. He wasn't chasing headlines or applause. He was learning, in the most visceral way, that power never concedes without a fight. His activism wasn't fashionable. It was lonely, often dismissed, even mocked. But it was real. When he moved to Vermont, Bernie didn't arrive as a polished insider. He didn't have corporate donors or the backing of party machines. He had stubbornness, a folding chair, and a belief that ordinary people deserved a champion. Running as an independent, he faced ridicule. The establishment called him a crank, a radical, a dreamer out of touch with reality. But he kept showing up, door to door, town to town, speaking the same truths he had carried since Brooklyn. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. The wealthy must pay their fair share. The working class deserves more than scraps. And over time, something remarkable happened. The people listened. In Burlington, they elected him mayor against all odds, a victory fueled not by money or connections but by trust. Bernie proved that authenticity could triumph over arrogance, that a man without polish could still move hearts if he spoke plainly, directly, honestly. While Cruz rehearsed sound bites for donors, Bernie was answering late-night phone calls from constituents who couldn't afford rent. For decades in Congress, he became a fixture, part outsider, part conscience. His speeches weren't elegant, his accent never smoothed into the polished tones of Washington. But when Bernie rose to speak, people leaned in. Because they knew he wasn't posturing. He was fighting. He fought for veterans abandoned by bureaucracy, for seniors robbed by rising prescription drug prices, for workers who built this country yet lived paycheck to paycheck. Each battle was uphill, and more often than not, he stood alone. But he never bent. Critics branded him too radical. Pundits rolled their eyes at his insistence on justice. Opponents scoffed that his ideas were unrealistic. Yet decade after decade, what was once radical became mainstream. Civil rights, marriage equality, universal healthcare, tuition relief, causes mocked in the past now defined the national conversation. And through it all, Bernie never changed his tune. He wasn't chasing polls. He wasn't reinventing himself for convenience. He was steady, stubborn, relentless. That consistency became his armor. While Cruz embodied the shifting theater of politics, Bernie embodied endurance. He was not a man polished for television. He was not a man who played to the elites. He was a man who carried the stories of millions, the janitor juggling 2 jobs, the teacher buying supplies from her own pocket, the immigrant family fighting for a foothold. Bernie's authenticity wasn't a strategy. It was who he was. So when he took the stage against Ted Cruz, he carried more than his own reputation. He carried decades of defiance against injustice. He carried the voice of every worker who had been told to be quiet, every patient who had been denied care, every family that had been made to feel small by a system designed to favor the powerful. He wasn't the slickest speaker. He wasn't the most rehearsed. But in an era of spin, his unvarnished truth had become a weapon more powerful than polish. And on this night, his lifetime of convictions would collide with Cruz's theatrics. The air thickened as the first volleys gave way to open fire. Cruz leaned into the microphone, the faintest smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, and asked with rehearsed disdain, "Senator Sanders, how many times will you sell the same empty promise? Free this, free that, until the country's bankrupt." His tone dripped with condescension, each syllable crafted to reduce Bernie to a caricature of socialism run wild. But Bernie didn't flinch. He leaned forward, voice steady, eyes locked on Cruz. "Let me tell you about Rosa," he began, the name slicing through the silence. "She's a single mother in Texas, your state, who works 2 jobs and still can't afford insulin for her child. She's not asking for a handout. She's asking to survive." The smirk faltered. A ripple went through the audience, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding in recognition. Bernie pressed on, his words growing sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. "So when you mock the word free, Senator, remember that Rosa's child may pay the price with their life because our system values profit over people." Cruz straightened his tie, forcing a laugh meant to belittle. "Here we go again, emotional anecdotes. We need policy, not bedtime stories." The audience reacted, some clapped, others hissed. The divide in the room was palpable, a mirror of the nation itself. Cruz thrived on these moments, relishing the spotlight. He flicked his hand dismissively, as though Bernie's passion was mere theatrics. But Bernie's voice rose, unshaken. "Policy is not abstract when families are being bankrupted by cancer. It is not theoretical when Americans die every day because they can't afford a doctor. That's the reality you mock. That's the reality your donors never face." The crowd erupted, half cheering, half bristling. Cruz's smile stiffened, but his eyes burned. He pivoted, raising his voice above the noise. "And what you're proposing is government takeover. Bureaucrats between you and your doctor. It's not compassion, Senator, it's control." The words hung heavy, designed to spark fear. For a moment, the room tilted toward him, his polished cadence carried weight, and the cameras caught his confidence. He knew the playbook well: equate fairness with tyranny, frame solidarity as servitude. Bernie waited, letting the silence linger just long enough for the tension to tighten. Then he answered, softer but cutting. "You talk about control. Right now, insurance companies, corporations you defend, decide whether a child gets medicine, whether a grandmother lives or dies. That is control, Senator Cruz. And it is immoral." The audience broke into thunderous applause. Even those hesitant moments before felt the truth in Bernie's words. Cruz shifted, his jaw tightening. The smugness that once looked effortless now seemed strained. For the first time, the debate stopped feeling like a game of wit. It became raw, personal, a clash not of arguments but of values. The stakes were no longer abstract, they were human, pressing, urgent. Bernie leaned back, almost calm now, as if he had laid bare the heart of the matter. Cruz, meanwhile, sharpened his eyes, readying for a counterstrike that could claw back control of the stage. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression, every bead of sweat. Millions watching at home knew, this was no ordinary exchange. This was the test of which vision would dominate America's future. And then came the moment that turned a heated debate into a historic confrontation. The debate had already boiled over into an arena of clashing philosophies. Cruz sharpened his gaze, trying to regain control, but Bernie, calm, resolute, unshaken, leaned toward the microphone. The noise of the crowd ebbed as if the room itself recognized something was about to happen. His voice was not thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was steady, deliberate, laced with decades of conviction. "Let me be very clear," Bernie began, raising one hand slightly for emphasis. "This is not about Democrats versus Republicans. This is about whether or not in the richest country in the history of the world, we allow children to die because their parents can't afford to take them to a doctor." The words dropped like lead weights. Silence followed. Even Cruz, poised to pounce, froze. Bernie leaned back for just a beat, letting the gravity sink in. Then he continued. "We give billionaires tax breaks so they can buy their third yacht, their fourth vacation home, their 50th piece of art. Yet, we tell working-class families, sorry, you can't afford chemotherapy. Sorry, you can't afford insulin. Sorry, you can't afford a hospital visit." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the audience rather than locking on Cruz. "Does that sound like freedom to you? Does that sound like morality?" The crowd erupted, cheers, applause, shouts of agreement. For a moment, Cruz's confident smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as though calculating how to claw back momentum. Bernie pressed forward, his cadence deliberate, measured, his Brooklyn accent thickening as emotion edged into his words. "We spend more on healthcare than any other country. Twice as much as Canada. 3 times more than many European nations. And yet, our outcomes are worse. Life expectancy lower. Infant mortality higher. And why? Because corporations, insurance companies, pharmaceutical giants, make billions off human suffering." A wave of clapping swelled again. Bernie raised his voice only slightly, riding the crest of energy. "Do you know how many people in America go bankrupt every year because of medical bills? Over 500,000. 500,000 families destroyed. You want to talk about personal responsibility, Senator Cruz? You want to talk about freedom? What freedom does a mother have when she has to choose between paying rent or paying for her child's chemotherapy?" The camera cut to Cruz, his smile was frozen, brittle, no longer playful but forced. The smirk had hardened into a mask. Bernie's hand gripped the podium, his eyes fierce now. "Let me tell you about one of those families. In West Virginia, I met a man named James. He worked in a coal mine for 30 years. His wife was diagnosed with cancer. Their insurance company, after decades of premiums, told them the treatment wasn't cost-effective. Imagine that. A life, not cost-effective." The crowd gasped. Bernie lowered his tone, softer now, almost whispering. "She died within the year. Not because doctors couldn't save her. But because greed decided she wasn't worth saving." For a long moment, the entire hall was still. Even Cruz shifted, tugging at his sleeve, his rehearsed confidence cracking under the weight of Bernie's story. Then Bernie straightened, voice rising again, filling every corner of the hall. "So when you talk about socialism, Senator Cruz, when you mock the idea that maybe, just maybe, healthcare should be a right, not a privilege, I want you to remember James. I want you to remember his wife. And I want you to tell their children why billionaires deserve another tax break more than their mother deserved to live." The crowd exploded. Cheers shook the rafters. Even some of Cruz's own supporters clapped, swept away by the moral force of the argument. The camera panned across faces, tears in some eyes, fury in others, but no indifference. Cruz's smile cracked entirely. His eyes darted to the moderator, as if searching for escape, for a chance to pivot. But the damage was done. The energy had shifted. Bernie didn't let up. He drove the point home, statistics like hammer blows, stories like lightning strikes. In Canada, no one goes bankrupt because of medical bills. In the UK, no one chooses between rent and medicine. In France, in Germany, in Scandinavia, people don't fear that getting sick means financial ruin. And somehow, miraculously, they all still have freedom. He paused, letting the words hang, then jabbed the podium lightly with his finger. Freedom isn't the ability of billionaires to hoard wealth. Real freedom is knowing that if your child gets sick, they will live. Real freedom is knowing you won't lose your home because you had a heart attack. That is the freedom I fight for. The audience roared again, cheers, chants, the kind of raw noise that makes walls vibrate. Cruz's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing into a glare. His signature smirk had vanished entirely. Bernie leaned back slightly, almost casual now, as if confident the strike had landed. And I will tell you something else, Senator Cruz. You can call me a socialist, you can mock me, you can attack me all you want. But I will wear your insults as a badge of honor. Because at the end of the day, I stand with the people who cannot afford your version of freedom. The room erupted once more. Standing ovations broke out in pockets. Even the moderator struggled to quiet the energy enough to move forward. Cruz tried to interject, his voice rising, words stumbling over each other. That's not, Senator, you're distorting, but his usual rhythm was gone. He looked rattled, defensive, caught off guard by the tidal wave Bernie had unleashed. Bernie, by contrast, stood calm, collected, almost serene in victory. He simply lifted his hand slightly, signaling he was finished, and the hall erupted again as though on cue. It was the mic drop moment. The turning point. The instant when the crowd, the cameras, the millions at home watching knew, this wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. And as the dust settled, the shockwaves rippled far beyond that stage. The debate stage may have quieted, but the country had only just begun to roar. Within minutes of Bernie's mic drop counterattack, the internet lit up like a storm front rolling across the nation. Twitter timelines surged with clips of Sanders staring down Cruz and delivering the line that felt less like politics and more like scripture: healthcare is not a privilege for the wealthy, it is a right for every human being. That sentence ricocheted across screens, shared by nurses finishing 12-hour shifts, by single parents juggling bills, by young activists who had felt invisible until that moment. The hashtag healthcare is a human right shot to the top of trending lists, a digital banner under which millions rallied. On TikTok, teenagers who had grown up watching their families ration insulin stitched the clip with their own stories, tears mixing with determination. On Facebook, working-class moms posted the video with captions like, "Finally, someone saying what we live every day." Memes spread faster than the spin machines could keep up with, Cruz's smug grin photoshopped into sinking ships, while Bernie's pause before his retort became a symbol of patience before truth detonates. Cable networks scrambled to catch up. CNN ran the clip on repeat, their anchors marveling at the precision of Sanders' rebuttal. MSNBC framed it as a turning point in the healthcare debate. Even Fox News couldn't avoid airing it, though their panels strained to reframe the narrative. It was theater, one conservative pundit insisted, but her voice wavered when confronted with the undeniable roar of the audience caught on tape. And it wasn't just progressives amplifying Bernie's words. Something unusual happened in the digital noise, cracks began appearing in conservative ranks. On Reddit forums and local talk radio shows, ordinary right-leaning Americans admitted that while they disliked socialism, they couldn't deny the power of Bernie's moral case. A factory worker in Ohio called into a show and said, "Look, I've voted Republican all my life. But when he said no kid should die because their parents can't pay, that hit me. That hit me hard." The host stammered, unable to redirect. Meanwhile, Cruz's defenders scrambled. His team clipped segments where he barked about big government and blasted them out to donors. Right-wing influencers posted warnings about Venezuela-style collapse. But their efforts felt forced, brittle, as though even they sensed the tide turning. For every slick soundbite they pushed, another wave of raw, human testimony surfaced online: patients, veterans, teachers, small business owners, echoing Bernie's words like a chorus. In immigrant households across the country, the debate replay wasn't just politics, it was personal validation. Families who had crossed oceans and deserts, who worked 2 jobs to afford basic care, saw in Bernie's conviction a recognition of their struggle. For them, this wasn't about left or right, it was about dignity. A young dreamer in Los Angeles tweeted, "Tonight, Bernie made me feel like I belong in this country. Like my health matters too." That post alone amassed 500,000 likes overnight. The ripple effect reached beyond screens. Activist groups seized the moment, organizing rallies under the fresh momentum of Bernie's words. In Chicago, volunteers projected the debate clip onto a downtown building. In Miami, a coalition of nurses gathered at sunrise, holding signs that read, "We are not numbers. We are patients." Across the country, healthcare workers felt seen, validated, and emboldened. Meanwhile, Cruz kept his public posture steady, but behind closed doors, frustration leaked. Reports surfaced of campaign aides snapping at journalists, of Cruz pacing hallways muttering about unfair framing. The polished debater, so used to controlling the narrative, was suddenly on the defensive, and it showed. For Bernie's supporters, however, this was vindication years in the making. People who had once been told their vision was naive, radical, impossible, now watched the national conversation bend toward them. They weren't just reacting, they were leading. The confrontation had crystallized what felt like an unstoppable momentum, a sense that moral clarity, when spoken with conviction, could break through the cynicism that usually drowned out hope. The memes, the hashtags, the rally cries, they were more than digital ephemera. They were proof that America had witnessed something raw and unfiltered, a clash where truth cut through theatrics. And though Cruz's defenders would fight to reframe it, the image that endured was simple, one man defending billionaires, the other defending the people. But beyond the viral clips, this confrontation left Americans asking a deeper question. As the echoes of the debate faded, one truth remained: this was never just about Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz trading verbal blows. It was about the values that formed the bedrock of America, tested in real time under the blinding lights of a national stage. Bernie had taken a clash of talking points and reframed it into something bigger, something timeless, a moral referendum on what kind of country America aspires to be. When Cruz leaned on cynicism and condescension, Bernie countered with dignity and moral clarity. It wasn't only about healthcare policy, it was about whether the nation would prioritize fairness over greed, compassion over arrogance, and community over division. That's why the moment landed so deeply. It wasn't Bernie's voice alone, it was the echo of millions of voices that had too often been ignored. History is rarely moved by spreadsheets or technical jargon. It shifts when leaders remind people of their worth. Sanders' words did not sound like statistics, they sounded like justice. When he declared healthcare a human right, it was more than policy, it was a creed. In that moment, he tapped into the same current of American tradition that once demanded the abolition of slavery, the end of child labor, the right of women to vote, and civil rights for all. Each of those struggles once faced sneers, cynicism, and charges of impossible. And yet, progress came because enough people dared to believe that fairness was worth fighting for. Bernie's clash with Cruz peeled back a deeper question: what kind of America do we want to be? An America where the wealthy secure privileges while working families are forced into impossible choices? Or an America where dignity isn't bought and sold, but honored as a birthright? This wasn't about left or right, it was about whether the nation would uphold the basic decency that most Americans quietly long for. For many, the confrontation was a reminder that politics at its best isn't about scoring points, but about defending people. Viewers across the spectrum, even those who disagreed on policy, could not deny the moral weight of the exchange. It crystallized the debate not as a battle of ideologies, but as a mirror reflecting who we are, and who we want to become. The moral lesson wasn't complicated. Sanders' performance revealed that true strength lies not in mocking the vulnerable, but in standing with them. True patriotism isn't protecting corporate profits, it's ensuring that ordinary Americans can live without fear of bankruptcy or untreated illness. And true leadership isn't measured by how loudly one defends the status quo, but by how bravely one envisions something better. The clash with Cruz reminded Americans that politics is not merely a theater of conflict, it is a stage where the nation's conscience is tested. Will we shrink back into cynicism, or will we push forward with compassion? Will we continue to accept an America divided by wealth, race, and geography, or will we fight for a union where every person's dignity is respected? For all the sound and fury of that night, this was the quiet lesson: fairness, dignity, and justice are not radical ideas, they are American ideas. They are the ideals carved into the nation's founding promises, even if they have never been fully realized. Every generation is asked, in its own way, whether it will rise to make those promises real. Bernie Sanders' exchange with Ted Cruz was one such moment. It wasn't a policy seminar, and it wasn't just political theater. It was a test of values. And in that test, Sanders reminded the country that moral clarity can still cut through the noise. And that's why this clash will be remembered as more than a debate, but as a mirror of America's soul. And so, the night came full circle. What began as Bernie Sanders versus Ted Cruz, the epic confrontation on healthcare and taxes, became something larger than politics. It became a reminder of what's at stake for every American. We didn't just witness a debate, we witnessed a clash of values. Cruz leaned on smug dismissals, mocking socialism and defending a system that leaves millions behind. Bernie countered with stories of dignity, humanity, and the unshakable belief that healthcare is not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. It was truth and empathy standing tall against arrogance and greed. And in moments like these, history reminds us, truth always outlasts cynicism. Dignity always cuts deeper than derision. The viral clips, the trending hashtags, the memes, those will fade. But the lesson remains: this debate was never about winning an argument, it was about asking a bigger question: what kind of America do we want to build? That question doesn't end here, it begins with you. If this clash moved you, if it stirred something in you about fairness, justice, and the kind of nation we can become, then don't let the conversation stop at this video. Share it. Talk about it. Challenge others to reflect on the values that truly matter. Because debates come and go. But the fight for dignity, fairness, and a better America, that fight is ongoing. So, if you believe in keeping that fight alive, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Join this community of people who refuse to settle for less, who believe that truth still matters, and who know that history is written by those who refuse to stay silent. Together, let's keep the conversation, and the movement, alive.